Today, I'm pleased to welcome Patrick Livingood. Patrick is an associate professor of anthropology at the University of Oklahoma. His research focuses on the archaeology of native peoples of eastern North America in the centuries before and after European arrival, including the archaeology of eastern Oklahoma and Spiro mounds. Patrick, if you would unmute.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for attending. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this great lineup of speakers. So Spiro is famous for the largest collection of ritual goods from anywhere in North America, and almost all of those are from a single space in Spiro, that of Craig Mound. And this is a huge part of the motivating factor for the reason this exhibit is here. These speakers are lined up. The goal is to share these amazing materials and their artistry with the public. And you've already heard some fabulous speakers in this series already. I'm going to be building on the work of two of them especially, and so I'll summarize them a little bit for those of you who were not able to hear them. Amanda Rainier talked to you about the history of looting and archaeology at Craig Mound. And that gives part of the reason why reconstructing the histories of these spaces can be so challenging. And Jim Brown also presented to you a few weeks ago, and he's done more work than anyone in reconstructing the history of how Craig Mound was constructed and used. And what's clear is that the practices at Craig Mound changed and morphed somewhat over almost 5 centuries of use. But also that much of what happened at Craig Mound was about certain themes that I want to talk about today. And what's important to know about is that for much of the history and use of Craig Mound, the key location is the location that Jim Brown has called the Great Mortuary. And this was a place to put bundles of burials and fragmented objects and to reconfigure over a really long span of centuries. And sometime around 1400 AD, the residents of Spiro sort of made a significant break and a significant change in what they did. In the space where the Great Mortuary had been in use for several centuries, they cleared this off, likely even dug into that space, created a sunken space surrounded by earthen berms, and inside of this created a display using objects, some made for the event, some that were heirlooms, 200 or so years old at the time of the event. And they created a very deliberate and staged display that Jim Brown has interpreted as a break in belief, where they are decommissioning older ways of doing things, older rituals, and older foci of these rituals in favor of new ones. After some period of time, logs were erected over this display and it was capped with earth, which created the sort of famed hollow sealed chamber of Craig Mound, and that remained sealed until the looters breached it in the 1930s. And because of that unique situation in which you have this airtight space that was there for centuries, it permitted the preservation of organic material in ways that we just don't see anywhere else in the eastern woodlands under most circumstances. The AD 14 event happens, they create, and I call it the AD 1400 event. We don't know that it happened exactly AD 1400, but we think it happened within a few decades. After the Spirit Lodge is sealed up, Spiro is ultimately abandoned within just a few decades. It's the qualities that make this new construction of the AD 1400 event, and Jim Brown calls this space the Spirit Lodge, and it's what makes the Spirit Lodge and the Craig Mound as a whole so astonishing. And one of those qualities is the preservation, which is, unknown or uncommon in the eastern US because of the temperate climates and rain. Another is just the sheer quantity of material. And another is the artistry, which the Spiro exhibit helps to highlight so well. And the last quality that gets everyone's attention is just that these materials that compose the Spirit Lodge and the Craig Mound come from so far away. You've got marine shell from the Gulf Coast, statues carved in the vicinity of present-day St. Louis, copper that comes from 1,000 miles away, and much, much more. So if you put all of this together, all the particulars, the Spirit Lodge is unique, but it also builds on a lot of traditions. And so in today's talk, I want to tell a story about the web of traditions and cultures that the Craig Mound is associated with. And I'm going to have the first part of the story is going to talk about space. We're going to start at the Craig Mound and eventually zoom out to the continental level and understand the scales of tradition and cultures that the Craig Mound tradition is interacting with. And the story is also going to span time, about 5 centuries worth. And the thread that I want to run through those narratives is that there are traditions that the AD 1400 event drew from, many of which were developed and maintained at Spiro and shared among the neighboring communities of the Arkansas Valley. And in many ways, these stories about cultures and traditions through time and space are kind of the bread and butter of what archaeologists do. We spend a lot of time just developing and reconstructing these things. And I think it's appropriate that that bread and butter story of what archaeologists do is part of this speaker series. There are a lot of stories to be told about Spiro, and the lineup of speakers and workshops demonstrates this. I'm glad that ancestral communities, descendant communities of Spiro are represented in these presentations and the workshops as a part of the exhibit. I personally strive to approach my work as an archaeologist with humility and know that I'm not telling the story of Spiro, I'm telling a story. I cannot and do not hope to tell the stories that the descendants have to tell. And so I do think it's appropriate that a sort of bread and butter information that archaeologists have about history and culture is a part of this series. If you want to learn more after hearing this talk, I would recommend these resources. The catalog, the book that was associated with this exhibit is really excellent. Going forward, it'll be the go-to source that I will have for students and members of the general public that want to learn more about Spiro. And the talk that I'm going to give today is paralleled by the chapter that I helped contribute to in that volume. Also, my close colleagues, Amanda Rainier and Scott Hammerstedt, as well as Sheila Savage, did an amazing review of the archaeology of the sites in Oklahoma around Spiro, much of which informs this talk, and it's well worth reading. Amanda and Scott are my close collaborators, and really any of the three of us could be presenting this talk today. And then Jim Brown's book, monograph on Spiro, still remains the most, is still the repository of the most information about that site of any source. So I want to start just at Spiro and do a tour of the site. So here's a map. I assume most of you have probably been to Spiro, but there might be a few out there that have not. And for those who have not, if you make a visit to the site, one of the striking features is that there's an elevation change. So we've got the lower terrace and the upper terrace. And this is 20, 25, 30 feet of higher elevation than this part, kind of depending on what exactly you want to compare. And this lower terrace is often soggy throughout the year. You can't imagine it would be a place to set a permanent settlement up, but it is the site where the Craig Mound, which is again a big part of the reason that we're all here today, it's where it was located. And the Craig Mound itself, as you've seen from photographs, is a multi-lobed mound, and it's got those distinctive 4 lobes. These ward mounds I'll mention briefly later on. These are relatively old. So if you tour the site, most people are going to walk past the Craig Mound and then you go up a trail. The Brown Mound is the largest mound at Spiro. It is a platform mound, meaning that it has a flat top, and platform mounds are the mound form that's most common across the Mississippian world. Generally, in the Mississippian world, these have flat tops because people put buildings or held activities on top of them, although it's not clear that any buildings were placed on top of the Brown Mound at Spiro. Arkansas Valley people didn't always put buildings on the flat top mounds. The next largest mound is Koppel, and it was really the only one of the large mounds at Spiro excavated using relatively modern methods. And what this shows is that the people of Spiro had very sophisticated and very complicated ways of building and remodeling Earth. These were not things to be set and left, but these are things to revisit and remodel, and the Koppel Mound shows that most clearly. The upper terrace, there are Brown Mound and then these house mounds and Koppel all together form a plaza, and that is sort of an empty space bounded by these mounds and these houses. And that's a pretty common feature in Mississippian sites. Most of these mounds, all those that start with HM, are house mounds, and perhaps another more accurate name for them is buried structure mounds. These involve having a structure that is at this site first, that is eventually decommissioned and then leveled or removed and then covered over by a sheet of earth. So that's the tour of Spiro. So let's zoom out. I'm going to zoom out in several scales to understand Spiro's geographic and cultural setting. So Spiro is located at a bend in the Arkansas River, and inside of the landform that Spiro is on, archaeologists refer to as the Fort Coffee region. And what's most notable is that during the 13th and 14th centuries, the Fort Coffee region was fairly densely occupied with hamlets and small settlements of people. And this would have been the people involved in life centered at Spiro, at least for that part of the history. If we zoom out further, so this is a map showing Arkansas, Oklahoma, and Missouri. Here is Spiro, denoted with the red star. And here's the Arkansas River. So Spiro is located along the Arkansas, and so this shows the Arkansas and its tributaries. And what this map shows is the arrangement of all of the sites that are culturally most related to Spiro. And so I'll call this the Arkansas Valley region. Sometimes it's given other names. And it's all of these sites share a history and a strong cultural affiliation with Spiro. If we zoom out even further, so this shows a map, we've got to go all the way from Louisiana to Kansas. Here's Spiro. And what's most important to note here is that this space is labeled by archaeologists as the Caddo Mississippian area, but that space can also be subdivided into a northern and a southern region. So we think of these as being cohesive in some ways because they share some similarities, especially in ceramics, but the northern and the southern area are also distinct in many respects and traditions, including architecture and other things. And then the biggest scale that I'm going to show is that between, about 900 or 1000 and 1500 AD, archaeologists classify and call the cultures that lived across much of the southeast and midwestern part of North America, and they label those as the Mississippian cultures or the Mississippian people. And they share a label because they shared practices. Most of them made flat top mounds, at least at some point, something looking like this. Again, pyramidal mounds with a flat top, often that was used to support some sort of structure or activity. Many of these communities grew maize, at least at some point in time, and many of these communities shared use of imagery that indicates that they shared stories about the nature of the cosmos and about certain culture heroes. And what's important to note is that Spiro in the Arkansas Valley fits at the far western edge of this Mississippian world. And as the exhibit, hopefully most of you are able to have been able to make it to the exhibit, shows, and many of the other talks in this series show, that there are really helpful ways in which we think of Spiro as Mississippian because of these shared traditions. But also within the Mississippian world, there's a lot of regional variation. And so certainly the Arkansas Valley Mississippians did things in a unique way that we're going to highlight today. So now, done with the story over space, I want to do the story over time. This chart down here, I'll keep as I progress through this story, shows how archaeologists have divided up time in the Arkansas Valley into various phases. Those of you who have read more about Spiro will know that there's actually multiple different systems archaeologists have for classifying units of time. There's this phase system, there's a grave lot system, and then there's some older classifications as well. I'm just going to focus on this and don't put too much stock into the boundaries at which I place the dates. Those are especially for purposes of today's talk, the general dates are all you really need to think about. So I'm going to start my story around 8950 in the period that archaeologists call the Evans phase. And at Spiro, Spiro starts being used during the Evans phase. And these three spaces, Ward Mound 1, Craig Mound, and House Mound 5, have the earliest evidence of use. And I'm going to start by talking about Craig Mound. And if we go back to this idealized cross-section of what Craig Mound looked like at the very end, I want to highlight that there was a pre-mound cemetery under what eventually became the South Primary Mound. And our evidence is that this pre-mound cemetery is one of the oldest things at Spiro. It's made up of 7 pits, each containing the remains of multiple individuals and burned bone. And these are mixed. They're secondary deposits. So typically Americans will think of cemeteries as being composed of bodies that are placed whole into a grave, a hole in the ground. But these are different. These are collections of materials of multiple people, and that's important as will be clear later on. These original founding burials were placed. They were eventually a layer of earth, a mound of earth was placed over them, and then inside of that was placed another pretty prominent set of burials, and these were again collections of skeletal materials, and those were interleaved with red cedar bark and woven together with vines. And what's important to recognize is that this set of practices becomes a pattern in the Arkansas Valley. Most of these mound sites start with a founding burial under a mound made up of mixed remains of multiple people. And as the mound is built over time, the construction appears to reference these founding burials. Things are placed deliberately over them that show that the later builders knew where this was and are aware and are referencing those founding burials. It's possible that, so this diagram is of what Craig Mound ultimately became. Jim Brown has speculated that for a while what was here in this region, the sort of the south and middle mound, was actually a platform mound for a time that just became modified over time, excavating into making deposits, making burials, sometimes cleaning them out. So if we move our focus to the other part of the site, House Mound 5 was excavated in the late 70s and early 80s. Again, much of what we know archaeologically about Spiro was done very early on, using methods that are not quite modern in their approach, and so there's limits. But House Mound 5 was excavated using essentially modern methods. And what House Mound 5 tells us is that there was a special purpose structure there before any mound was there. It was ultimately decommissioned. Another structure, almost very similar in scale and size, was placed on the spot, and then a third version of this. And then this was capped over ultimately with earth. And this is an artist's reconstruction of what those structures might have looked like. They've got these substantial center posts They have an extended entryway that would have caused someone going in and out of this to stoop over to move in and out. And based on what was found, it's likely that this was used by someone who participated in mortuary ritual, but also might have been a home. So it may have actually been the home of a person and their family, and then they were responsible for carrying out ritual activities at the site. But this is, again, early. This is one of the, appears to be one of the first sets of constructions here at Spiro. The last thing I want to say about the Evans phase is that those submound burials have at Spiro, as well as some other sites, have ceramics that indicate long distance exchange. And this first set of long distance exchange are vessels like the ones pictured here that were likely made somewhere in central or southwest Arkansas because of the way they look. So just keep that in mind as we move through our story here. So I'm going to move to the next phase in time. So the Harlan phase is what archaeologists use to label the people in the Arkansas Valley between 1050 and 1250 AD. And it is the most dynamic period in the Arkansas Valley. So at Spiro, essentially by the start of the Harlan phase, Spiro, all of these mounds appear to have been made and appear to have been in use. They Brown and Koppel Mound start to be constructed in the Harlan phase. Most of the house mounds appear to have been used or in use. And at Craig Mound, I already mentioned that sort of the focus for many centuries of Craig Mound was the Great Mortuary, which is underneath the north lobe. And that definitely starts being in use during the Harlan phase. If we zoom out, what makes Harlan phase so dynamic regionally is that all of these sites highlighted in blue are founded at some point during the Harlan phase. Most of them are founded right at the beginning of the Harlan phase. There is clearly what is likely a generation or two in which lots and lots of mound sites are founded and get their start. And it's clear that they have as a template some of the practices that were developed at Spiro. My colleagues Amanda Rainier and Scott Hammerstead have pointed out that what we can tell from Eufaula is sort of they think of this as the type for this Arkansas pattern of making a founding burial. So at Eufaula, there were founding pre-mound burials, so buried in the ground before the mound was there. It was located to under what is ultimately become the south end of the mound. There's a layer of earth that caps that, and then there are burials placed in the next layer that are directly above the founding ones. And then in the third layer, there are burials placed directly above the ones in the founding ones. And not only that, but in that third layer, the only burials with grave goods are directly above the founding one. This is clearly clues that the people at Eufaula were aware of the founding burials and were venerating them. And so collectively, what we see with the kind of rituals that are taking place at Craig Mound and Eufaula and Norman and Harlan is that the theme of these is about veneration of ancestors. These are not veneration of a single individual. These are not honoring a single individual. These are honoring people collectively. And if there's any focus, it's a focus on founding ancestors. Sorry, I skipped this site. These are the sites where I think we see the clearest pattern of using founding burials. Okay. As I mentioned, during the Evans phase, we have this long distance connection to central or southwest Arkansas. During the Harlan phase, we have just within the last few years learned about another really dynamic long distance connection that Spiro had. Namely, we had a PhD student named Sean Lambert, who's now a faculty member at Mississippi State, and he was looking at fineware vessels, most of which date to the Harlan phase, especially late Harlan phase. And these are some of the nicest, just some of the most gorgeous ceramics that are made anywhere. They're really thin-walled, really highly decorated, highly polished. Many of them are bottles, so that means that these are, involved in serving. These are not everyday wares. These are important goods reserved for important events if they're going to be used. And these are also found in some of the most important contexts at Craigmount and others. And in fact, one of the styles of fine wares is even called Spiro engraved because we have so many examples of it from Spiro. And what Sean learned with his work through neutron activation is that none of the fine ware vessels from the Arkansas Valley that he tested were made in the Arkansas Valley. Instead, they were made in this area, somewhere in this area in red. So it's the southern Caddo area. And so clearly they were all of the, these examples of small vessels were all being transported from the southern Caddo area to Spiro and other sites in the Arkansas Valley. The nature of the chemical testing that we can do means that we can't narrow it down specifically to these areas, but Sean had several other clues that lead us to think that a likely source for many of these is probably the site of Crenshaw, which is located in Arkansas. And Crenshaw also could have been the source of the Coles Creek incised sherds from earlier. And so if Crenshaw was the place that they were bringing at least some of this, that's a long ways away. It's like 125 miles, and would have been, quite they can't just get UPS to deliver. This would have been an investment. These would have been very nice vessels. And what I want to highlight is this doesn't just indicate contact. It doesn't just indicate trade and exchange, but because these fineware vessels are found in really important ritual and mortuary contexts, this is indicating not just goods of convenience and goods of value, but clearly that Arkansas Valley people put a great deal of value on things that are coming from far away. Okay, so now I'm going to move to the Norman and Spiro phase, and I'm going to lump those together. Archaeologists classify these as two different sets of periods of time, 1250 to 1350, 1350 to 1450. But for purposes of my story, I'm going to kind of lump them together for matters of time. So during the Harlan phase, you have all of these centers that are founded. And most of them are found at the beginning. Some of them are founded late. Norman and Reed were founded during the later part of the Harlan phase. But by the end of the Harlan phase, all of these centers that have been founded are abandoned. So they're not in use for very long. So going into the Norman phase, really the only outlying mound sites, so here's Spiro, that continue to be used other than Spiro, are Norman and Reed. And so what we see is just we go from activity focused in the Arkansas Valley on Spiro to then expanding out to mound sites all over the Arkansas Valley, to then reconfiguring to very few mound sites along the Arkansas Valley. Instead, the area around Spiro, this Fort Coffee region, becomes much more populous than it had been before. And so we suspect that people are leaving outlying centers like Eufaula and moving, at least some of them, to the Fort Coffee region. And they are creating small hamlets and perhaps you might even call them villages especially along the edges of this landform. And they're the ones that are participating in life at Spiro during this time period. Also, cemeteries are established. So before now, all mortuary activity that we know of take place in and around mounds. But people are now using cemeteries. They're not exclusively using mounds. Lastly, during the Norman and Spiro phase, Spiro makes itself world famous in increasing and investing in long distance exchange. So these are when many of the goods get to Spiro that have made it so famous that make up the exhibits. So we have copper, shell, pipes, and other things. So what we really see is during the Norman and Spiro phase, so we go from southward focused exchange before this to eastward focused exchange in the Norman and Spiro phases especially. And you see this in other ways of life. It's during this time period that the people of the Arkansas Valley switched to using shell tempering, which had been a common Mississippian temper, but is adopted in the Arkansas Valley now. And I think it's important to note that these long distance goods, these are not just base valuables and baubles, but they are being deployed in mortuary and ritual contexts, and almost certainly are communicating messages about the relationships of members of the community with their ancestors. So this one I can't place in time, as I'm going to explain in a moment, but it's going to describe some work that I've been personally involved with over the last several years, along with my colleagues, University of Oklahoma, Oklahoma Archaeological Survey, and Arkansas Archaeological Survey. Our team was responsible for helping to do remote sensing across all of the open areas of Spiro. Remote sensings these are technologies like radar and magnetometry that essentially are like a X-ray or a CAT scan for the ground, and without disturbing anything, let you see patterns of use and disturbance. And with these, I'm not going to talk about our general results. I just don't have the time. But one of the most striking things we found is that in the vicinity of Craig Mound, we found dozens of anomalies. That's these little black circles all over this space. And there's a lot of them, and they're all similar-ish in size, and they're all about the right size to be a building, a structure of some sort. And several years ago, field crews from the University of Oklahoma and Oklahoma Archaeological Survey, along with our colleagues from Arkansas, went and excavated some of these anomalies. Several of them are located along a creek that is actively eroding, and the Corps of Engineers that owns the site and the descendant Caddo and Wichita tribes were fine with us going and excavating some of these structures that would be eroding over some frame of time. And what we found were structures, but they're really odd structures. They don't look like any of the other structures we know from the Arkansas Valley, which tend to be substantial and well engineered and nice. These are tiny and haphazard. These are thrown up relatively quickly. And we've also got some other little clues here. These anomalies, these marks in the ground, we don't see overlap. So we suspect that there was one moment in time in which most of these were all here at once. And what was here was a bunch of really rickety temporary buildings, but they're clustered around the Craig Mound. And so what we're communicating to others is what we think we have evidence for is a pilgrimage event to Spiro in the vicinity of Craig Mound, in which probably 80 or more structures were put up as temporary shelters. So the problem we have right now is that we don't know exactly when this occurred. The 4 temporary structures that we excavated really didn't have any artifacts, didn't have the kinds of things that we would use as archaeologists to help figure out when this was. So perhaps this was a pilgrimage of people that participated in the construction of the Spirit Lodge around AD 1400, but it could have been earlier. The Craig Mound was in use for 450, 500 years, and until we find more evidence, we won't really be able to say when this pilgrimage happened. I don't have a slide for this, but the final phase in the Arkansas Valley, archaeologists call the Fort Coffee phase. So as I mentioned, Spirit Lodge was constructed around AD 1400. It was capped over, but by AD 1450, there's a pretty radical change in the way, in the lifestyle of the people who are living in the vicinity of Spiro and in the Arkansas Valley. They go from having folks that we think of as being Mississippian and living a life of the kinds of crops they growing and the kinds of houses they build, of looking very Mississippian and Eastern woodlands like, to having lifestyles and traditions and technologies that are very plains focused. And so we call that new phase the Fort Coffee phase. We are not able to resolve at the moment what exactly the connection is between the Spiro phase people of the Arkansas Valley and the Fort Coffee phase. Likely this involves some people leaving Spiro area and then being joined by newcomers and adopting things like bison hunting and use of bison scapula hose and digging bell-shaped pits like the people across the plains dig. Okay. So I've told the stories across space and time that I want to share, and I want to finish by sort of drawing together three themes. As I've said, what I hope that you get out of this talk is an understanding that the Spirit Lodge, the Craig Mound, is unique, but it is draws upon traditions that were present in the Arkansas Valley, present at Spiro, going back to AD 950. As others have reconstructed, there might have been reasons for what happened at around AD 1400, that the people of Spiro in the Arkansas Valley were suffering through probably the worst drought that region has experienced in the last millennium. And Jim Brown and others, including Alex Barker and George Sabo, have interpreted the construction of the Spirit Lodge as an attempt to reboot the world, restart time, to redirect ritual focus and devotion. And those might have been motivated by the fact that they were in the middle of this really terrible drought. And so it may have been feeling like their world was ending in some ways. And what they constructed was, in many ways unique, and it took place at an unprecedented scale. But the conceptual toolkit that they used to craft this drew upon centuries of tradition. And some of those traditions are shared widely across the Mississippian world, but many of them are specific or especially strong in the Arkansas Valley. So one of them is the use of specialized ritual architecture. Again, the exact configuration of the Spirit Lodge is unique, but there was a long tradition at Craig Mound, at Spiro, and in the Arkansas Valley of reconfiguring existing mortuary and ritual spaces in new ways through excavation and reconfiguration and the creation of earthen berms, of the movement of objects within into new contexts. And there are other examples that I didn't have time to talk about today of architecture where one finds two or three examples of a particular pattern. So these multi-lobe mounds like Craig Mound, or marker mounds that are in the vicinity of Spiro that are built late, or specific kinds of charnel houses. These kinds of limited traditions and experimentation with new forms, especially reconfiguring earth to make them, goes way back. And so the fact that the Spirit Lodge is using berms and reconfiguring existing ritual space builds on those traditions. What makes the Spirit Lodge, what makes Craig Mound famous is the fact that it's got these materials that come from so far away. But that, again, is a tradition that goes way back. And it's not just a tradition of long-distance exchange, because there are lots of places in native North America where those traditions existed. But it's putting those materials that come from a long distance in such a central, important ritual and mortuary context. And clearly, Spirit Lodge just does this in the most spectacular way possible. And then lastly, as I've said, much of the mortuary activity across the Arkansas results in depositions of groups, not individuals. And the architecture that is used and the arrangements of things is designed to commemorate, again, groups, not individuals, and commemorate them in a collective sense with a special focus on founding burials. And the Spirit Lodge itself is built on the longest, the place at Spiro that has had the longest tradition of this. And Jim Brown has made the case that it's bestowed recognition and power because it's placed over this home of the ancestors. And even within the display, the outer ring of it is composed of wooden statues that are ancestor statues. They're an audience. So the focus has remained for almost 5 centuries at Spiro of respecting and commemorating and building forth upon displays that emphasize community and ancestors. All right, thank you. There's so many folks that have helped contribute to the ideas that I presented today. My close collaborators, Amanda Rainier and Scott Hammerstedt. Again, these are ideas and that they could have easily shared with you, the broader Spiro team, and we've also had so much support from the Caddo and the Wichita tribes and from many other organizations that have made our work possible. So thank you all.
Thank you, Patrick. And as a reminder to the folks that are watching, if you do have questions, add them into the Q&A field. We've got several lined up. The first one, Patrick, is why are the activities of the mining company often referred to as looting as opposed to grave robbery?
It is. I mean, yeah, you could use either one of them. Yes, absolutely. I mean, what makes it, clearly they were chased off. Archaeologists came in. The Pecola Mining Company was there. It was, their motivations were profit, and they were not interested in preserving information in any way. And they certainly were demolishing, and removing. As a part of that, not just their interest was in the objects to make money, and they were clearly disturbing graves in the process of doing that. So yeah, either one of those labels would be appropriate.
All right, thank you. And why are the phases named what they are? The Evans phase, the Harlan phase?
Those are just named after various sites and traditions, so yeah, they've typically. In the case they were naming at Harlan Norman phases were originally named after sites that were thought to be key sites that were thought to be exemplars of those time periods. At the time those were named. So, yep. Thank
you. And how important is Spiro in context to the overall ritual mound buildings of Native people? There are many mound sites in that region. How important was Spiro kind of in all of those mound sites?
Well, so it depends on what scale you're talking about. So certainly within the Arkansas Valley, Spiro is the, can you guys, are the slides visible to folks?
Yes.
So within the Arkansas Valley, Spiro is the oldest. It remains the largest, and it's in use for the longest period of time. And it appears to be the first place that many of the traditions that are deployed at these other Arkansas Valley mound sites were deployed. And so Spiro is clearly an incredibly important location. And how that was viewed by the people that were here, we don't know. Certainly the distances between these communities is such that we don't expect Spiro had political control over them, but they clearly shared ideas about the way the world was formed and about the proper way to build mounds and the proper way to bury people within mortuary mounds. Ultimately, Spiro outlives all of these other sites. So it is by far the most important one in the Arkansas Valley. But more broadly, there's all kinds of other traditions of communities across the eastern woodlands, and I'm not quite sure how to tackle that question in a more broad sense. So I hope that was satisfactory. whoever asked.
Thank you. And you had mentioned early in your talk that Craig Mounds and one or two of the other mounds are located at a lower elevation compared to some of the others. Is there a thought as to why those three mounds were lower elevation and the others were at the higher?
Well, so the first thought is the elevation that Brown Mound and these others are on is sort of the elevation that you would want to be at if you had a permanent residence or a permanent structure here. So even today, you get a heavy rain and there can be an inch or two or more of standing water in this lower elevation. So it's low, it's not far from the Arkansas River, it's mucky, it's poorly drained. And so, I think, and as you look across Fort Coffee, when more people come to live, they are all living at a place that is this elevation as you go around this landform. And so one part of that answer is that you need to live at a certain elevation just to not, just to not be wading through water for some number of weeks per year. So the question is why, if this area is so mucky, is Craig Mound here? That's a good question. There are probably other people who could answer this more artfully, but certainly I think many Native American communities saw a link between the underworld and thoughts of it as a watery place. And so the fact that this is occasionally watery and also this place of mortuary ritual probably seemed appropriate to Spiroans, would be my guess.
Okay, very good. Concerning pottery, what is shell tempering and grog tempering? Grog tempering. I'm glad somebody asked this because I was wondering too.
Excellent question. So when you make pottery, especially using earthenware, so just the kinds of pottery you can make using clay that any of us could go dig up, and campfires, the process of firing it is a risky one. And if you're not careful, if the pot is not dried to the right level, if it has a thickness that's off, if it has flaws in it, it can break in the firing process. It can crack. And then also when it's in use, potters all around the world have found that by adding things to the clay when you make the pot, that is temper, you can make it so that the pot survives the firing more readily, and also that it serves its other functions after it's fired better. And so in the eastern woodlands, the two most common tempers are grog and shell, although there are many other tempers that people used from when pottery was started being made. Grog is simply ground up pieces of old pottery, and the reason that most tempers work is because as their firing process is going, they're expanding and contracting at a different rate than the rest of the clay, and that has some advantageous properties. And so grog, being previously fired clay, helps hold the vessel together during that expansion and contraction period of the firing process. Shell is just ground up muscle shell. You often have to treat it to make it useful. And shell has advantages in pots because it's makes it a little bit more so that it's less porous because those small plates of shell align, but also very importantly, it's has better thermal shock resistance. So that is, once the finished pot is heated and cooled, sometimes rapidly, it's less likely to instantaneously crack.
All right, thank you. What is a marker mound, and are there any effigy mounds in Oklahoma or the Arkansas Valley area similar to Serpent Mound?
I'm not familiar of any effigy mounds in Oklahoma or in the Arkansas Valley. Schedule and Kavanaugh are two mounds that were built relatively late in the vicinity of Spiro, and they are both relatively empty mounds. There's just not a lot of stuff in them. Again, I would encourage you, if you want to read more, you can read Amanda Rainier et al.'s book. They've got some more information about both and some leads. And so we're not really sure what they're there for, but they sort of line up with each other and with Spiro in a way that these might have been depicting an important axis to the people that were there. So since they don't have a whole lot in them and there doesn't appear to be a whole lot of activities around, we suspect they were marking a space, and so we've got guesses about what that might be, that they combine, create a sacred axis, but those are best guesses for archaeologists.
All right, thank you. And what is a shaft tomb?
So they're throughout the Caddo world, there was a relatively late tradition of revisiting existing mounds, sometimes that had not been in use for some period of time, others that had had a more continuous use, and digging, often in the middle, digging a shaft down through it, sometimes to beneath the original surface of the mound, and then putting burials within those. And so there is a shaft tomb at the Brown Mound. They know it's there, they could see the outline of it, but no one excavated into the bottom of that shaft tomb. But most shaft tombs are found further south in the Caddo world.
Thank you. And did the geophysical investigation reveal any evidence of a palisade at Spiro?
We don't think so. So there's one, no. As far as we can tell, I don't think there are any Caddo sites that have been documented to have palisades.
Okay.
So, there's some potential large posts that we discovered. I don't think there's enough of them to be part of a palisade, but perhaps at some future time that will be investigated.
Thank you. And have you had the opportunity, I just lost my question. Hang on. Have you had the opportunity to study any of the traditional veneration in Ireland or Great Britain? And if so, how does that compare to Spiro?
I couldn't speak to that.
Okay. You had mentioned one of the doctoral candidates or one of the other researchers doing neutron activation testing. Mm-hmm. What is that?
Excellent question. So one of the big revolutionary technologies that has made its way into archaeology and has sort of been especially influential in giving us new ways to understand the past in the last approximately 20 years have been compositional analyses. And so these are ways of studying materials to help give you clues about where they started. And in the case of pottery, the most common compositional study is called neutron activation. And the end result of it is to tell you the abundance of different elements. And then what you do is you do a survey of the spaces where you might, the places that they might have gotten the original clay from, and then compare archaeological sherds and their elemental composition with the sources to figure out, okay, where did the clay for this come from? Neutron activation works by essentially irradiating the material or some small part of it, and then getting back information from the decay of those materials. There's some other techniques to get at compositional data, either elements or minerals or other things, and they've all been incredibly influential in helping us to try to figure out where things started off, because obviously archaeology has where they end up, but now we can understand where they started.
Thank you. So looking at the quickly constructed structures that you indicated with those little kind of darker spots on the imagery, are there specific things that might indicate a possible pilgrimage, or could they have been temporary housing for people who were part of a migration from one area to the next?
Yeah, so So clearly calling it pilgrimage is making a guess about what the purpose of this was. Mm-hmm. And that's informed by the fact that they're clustered around Craig Mound. Unfortunately, I don't have the better one that sort of helps us. So if you'll notice, this part of the image is really noisy, and this part of the image is less noisy. This had been, at some point in the deep past, a relic channel of the Arkansas River. So it's churned up soils, and so it's magnetically noisy compared to this. So it's easy to see where these anomalies are here. It's a lot harder to see where they are in this space. But when you have them, you see that these are sort of collected around the Craig Mound. And not only that, the proximity of these structures is they're closer to each other here than they are here. It's as if the kind of pattern you'd get if people are crowding around the Craig Mound a little bit. So we're pretty sure that they are here because of the Craig Mound. That's what this gathering is about. And given its history as a ritual, as a place of ritual, that's why we use the name pilgrimage. It is entirely possible, of course, that they are here for other reasons. There's a large space here that, it would not have surprised me if it wasn't in use for dances at many, many different points in time. So there's, we gave a talk a year or two ago in which we analogized, the way the space was arranged to the way, so for example, modern communities come together to have their dances. So all we can say is that they are almost certainly temporary, but we can only make some guesses beyond that.
All right, thank you. And what's the connection between Spiro and Cahokia, or is there a connection?
So, certainly Spiro, there are multiple objects that were made somewhere in the vicinity of Cahokia that ultimately end up at Spiro in the Spirit Lodge. Most of them, by the time they end up in the Arkansas Valley, it seems to be the best clues are that these are sort of old objects by the time they make it to the Arkansas Valley. In terms of what that exact relationship is, that's an excellent question, and I don't know. We certainly find more things from the Cahokia region at Spiro than we do the other way around. But that's true. Spiro has so much material. It's clearly there's an asymmetry. It appears in the way things are moving, and so and the other big influence is that Jim Brown and others have pieced together the artistic styles of Spiro, and clearly those artistic styles were informed and based on styles that were made in the vicinity of Cahokia. So I think clearly there was some sort of a connection. There's an influence. To what extent those influences are direct and sustained, and to what extent those influences are stories of something in the past, we don't know. And one of the challenges is that there's so much known about Cahokia, and lots of things are well dated there. We don't have the same kind of secure dates of what those things are in many Spiro contexts, and so that leaves a fuzziness. And some of that will be hard to resolve because these excavations were not done up to modern standards.
All right, thank you. Unfortunately, we aren't able to get to all of our questions in our time period, but Patrick, thank you for your time today and giving us a little bit different view of Spiro mounds. And for everyone watching, thank you.